Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is polyamory? I've also received the question about open relationships and consensual non-monogamous relationships. So these concepts have kind of an interesting relationship. We see a lot of terms being thrown around the concept of polyamory and open relationships. And sometimes the terms are misused, and sometimes there's not an agreed upon definition. So I'm going to try to untangle this a bit and explain this construct of polyamory. So first I'm going to start with the idea of the CNM, the consensual non-monogamous relationship. Here we see that this is any relationship where the partners have extra dyadic sexual or romantic relationships. So it's kind of a broad, overarching term. Now the term open relationship is really fairly similar. We see implicit and explicit rules here in open relationships that define which types of extra dyadic sexual activities are permitted in that relationship. So the term open relationship is really an umbrella term that covers non-monogamous relationships, and that's a term that covers polyamory. So if we look at it in terms of from broad to narrow, it would be open, non-monogamous relationships, and then polyamory as well as many other types of relationships would be under that. And again, a lot of these terms are used in different ways. That's just how it's understood really in the research literature, although we could really use more research on this topic. So let's take a look at some of these structures underneath of this open relationship structure. We see a few different constructs like partnered non-monogamy. So this is a couple and they are committed to one another, but then they involve themselves in sex with other individuals. Now sometimes this is thought of as swinging, but swinging is really a little bit different. It's non-monogamy in social settings. So this usually involves groups of partners that come together and engage in sexual activity. So we see here that they separate sex and love. So with swinging, sex is the only behavior that's accepted when it occurs with somebody outside the partnership. So this moves us to the concept of polyamory. And this is where partners have more than one relationship. And really there are different types of polyamory. We see solo polyamory. This is when non-monogamous individuals don't want a primary partner. Sometimes a primary partner here is referred to as an anchor partner. So it's a group of individuals that have different relationships, different sexual and romantic relationships with each other. And an individual who considers themselves engaging in solo polyamory doesn't have that primary partner among those people, or anywhere actually. Now polyfidelity is when 3 or more people make a commitment to one another, similar to what we see in monogamy, a commitment of love and usually sexual activities involved in that. So this is where you really see the difference with polyamory. It's when somebody can love more than one person in a romantic way. So again, that's just one type of open relationship. Some open relationships only sex is allowed outside the primary relationship. With polyamory, love is allowed outside the primary relationship, and there might not be a primary relationship. And the last type I'll review here specifically for open relationships is the monogamous/non-monogamous partnership. So this is where only one member of a romantic partnership is monogamous, and the other one potentially has sex with other people and could be in love with other people. So this gets really complex as compared to monogamy. With open relationships and polyamory, there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of different relationships that have to be maintained. Now another way that we see open relationships compared to polyamory in terms of the definitions would be that open relationships, there would always be a primary partner involved. So it's 2 people that are together, and then there's all these activities outside of that relationship. That's just one way of looking at it. And under that conceptualization, polyamory is only different because of that aspect of loving other people, so loving more than one person. So with all these nuances and potential definitions for these terms, this really emphasizes how important it is to do a thorough assessment and understand what the client is engaging in, what they consider their activity to be, and what they're actually doing, and to see if those match. Because some people might come in and say they're polyamorous, but really it seems more like a different type of open relationship. So again, it's important to really get into at least some of the details to understand the nature and the structure of the various relationships. So now taking a look specifically at polyamory. So I'm going to break this concept down a little more. What we really see here with polyamory is a rejection of the expectation that one partner can meet somebody's needs. So all these relational needs can be broken down into certain domains like emotional, social, economic, intellectual, and of course sexual. And with this polyamorous relationship, you see there's usually a lot of structure and limits put in place. So typically they're thought of as well-defined relationships. Just like in monogamy, we see that's relatively well-defined. Polyamory can have the same level of structure and definition. So we don't have a lot of research on polyamorous relationships, and the little research that we do have, we see very small sample sizes. So really, in terms of the scientific literature, we don't know a lot about these relationships. Here's what the findings have been so far, though. If we look at the current findings, again, they're quite limited. They suggest that polyamorous relationships are just as satisfying as monogamous relationships. And the relationships are not really any different in terms of what we see with the prevalence of mental disorders, so psychopathology, attachment styles, and different types of personalities. Now again, this is based on limited research. In my clinical experience, I would say that openness to experience is a bit higher usually in somebody who's polyamorous, right? So openness to experience has facets like adventurousness, imagination, fantasy, a tendency toward more liberal thinking, and intellectual curiosity. So usually we see higher openness to experience, but we don't necessarily have to see that. But again, that goes against the small amount of research that indicates there are no personality differences. I've also seen in my clinical experience differences on the extroversion trait as well, especially assertiveness. So there may be a few differences in personality that have been undetected, or this just may be what I've seen, and there could be no personality differences between people that are monogamous and people that are polyamorous. Now, in terms of prevalence, it's really hard to say how common these relationships are because there's a stigma associated with these types of relationships. Our best guess from the research literature is around 4% of individuals would identify themselves as in a consensually non-monogamous relationship. So that's, again, based on just such a small sample size that we really don't know. There could be many more. There's a lot of different reasons somebody might not tell their friends and family about this type of behavior, about polyamorous behavior. So we do see around this area of stigma that these consensual non-monogamous relationships are often portrayed negatively. Now, one of the groups that has been studied in terms of the stigma has been mental health clinicians. Mental health clinicians have been participants in research studies where they've been asked questions about polyamorous relationships and their thoughts about people that are engaged in polyamory. And about a third of mental health clinicians believe that individuals who are polyamorous have at least one personality disorder. And the personality disorders we hear about a lot here would be borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. All three of these cluster B personality disorders. They also view, clinicians tend to view infidelity as more normal than polyamory, which is a little unusual considering that infidelity by definition involves dishonesty and polyamory by definition involves honesty. So interesting that the stigma unfortunately is partially maintained by mental health clinicians that don't have the correct training and education to conduct therapy with polyamorous individuals. So it's just worth noting here that of course many mental health clinicians are qualified to treat individuals who are polyamorous, and they do a fairly good job. The stigma is not maintained solely by mental health clinicians. The stigma is largely maintained by the general population, and many individuals in the general population consider polyamory to be deviant behavior, and therefore it's not really openly discussed and not generally accepted. So as I mentioned a few times, there's limited research on this topic. The research articles that I did look at to prepare for this video, I'll put the references in the description for this video. And I want to review specifically one of these articles that looked at open relationships in general, and some of the findings that they had I thought were pretty interesting. So in the study of open relationships, they found that the decision to engage in this type of relationship was largely mutual, which isn't surprising. They found that the decision was also not so much about sex, but more about freedom and getting to know other people. Although in general, the men were more likely to be interested in the sexual satisfaction component, and the women in the study were more interested in this sense of being free, this freedom component of open relationships. Another finding of this study was that the rules are fairly clear. Again, there's a lot of structure with these relationships, and an open relationship does not mean that a person is moving from person to person in terms of romantic activity and sexual activity. So these arrangements tend to be more organized than that. And in terms of cheating, infidelity can still happen, but a lot of the behaviors that are classified as infidelity in these open relationships are around the ideas of lying and withholding information. So that's what we learned from the research, but what about from my clinical experience? Well, I've dealt with a number of people who are polyamorous and in open relationships, and I found a few different things about those relationships, just in my experience, I think are pretty interesting. One, which was noted in the research, is that cheating still happens. When mental health clinicians get into the field, when they're relatively new into the field, one of the things I hear them say is they're surprised by certain characteristics that they observe in people, because again, mental health clinicians are hearing information that a lot of times people aren't going to discuss with somebody from the general population, not necessarily with friends or family, but they'll reserve those discussions for the clinical relationship. And the elements that people express surprise about, oftentimes the clinicians express surprise about, would be that there's a lot more drugs being used than anyone would believe. Drug use is very high, impulsivity is very high, and cheating is very common. And this is really one of the things that really stands out. When individuals are new at counseling, they start talking to people and they realize that infidelity is really widespread. And I've found that with polyamorous relationships, they're not immune from infidelity. Not just the lying and withholding information, but adding partners without telling the primary partner. This happens in monogamous relationships, of course, and it happens in polyamory too. Something else I've noticed about polyamory is that it's really challenging. A lot of the same struggles that we see with monogamy, we see with polyamory. When you look at relationships, they're really quite difficult. And when you add more relationships, you make it more complex, it becomes more difficult. So polyamory isn't kind of an easy way out. It's not an easy way to have needs met. It's actually a fairly difficult way to have needs met. And it takes a lot of application of intellectual energy, trying to keep things straight, and a lot of conscientiousness, trying to stay organized and be aware of a lot of different people's feelings. So I would look at polyamory and say it's complex. Monogamy is complex, but polyamory is even more complex. And I think a lot of people get into it because they think it'll help solve problems. They believe it'll help meet needs and help them be happier. And I think it could lead to that sometimes, but the complexity can't be underestimated. Another element I've noticed in polyamory, especially solo polyamory where there is no primary relationship, is that loving more than one person at some point is going to mean prioritizing. So there's going to be like an event that's occurring, maybe a social event, on the same night with two different partners, and a person is going to have to make a decision. There are going to be holidays and other special days, and there's just going to have to be a decision made at some point to prioritize one relationship over the other. And what I've found is this really leads to difficulty. This is when polyamorous relationships, open relationships, I think really tend to get more threatened, when you see these special events and these tough decisions had to be made. The last observation I have here about polyamorous relationships has to do with the construct of love. I've noticed with love that it has both momentum, so mass times velocity, if you want to put it in terms of physics, so it's moving and it has a force to it. It has energy to it, and it tends to move things out of the way, and it tends to push people in certain directions. And it also has acceleration, so its velocity is not constant. And what happens usually over time in romantic relationships to a point is that they become stronger, right? So we see, again, momentum, the love momentum, and the love acceleration. And love is a lot more complex than sex, I think, in most ways. And what happens here in a lot of polyamorous relationships is that one person will start to love another person in a more possessive and exclusive way. And I know that possessiveness and exclusivity aren't necessarily parts of love, but it's what happens. That's what I've observed in my clinical experience. And that, I think, is one of the greatest challenges to these types of structures. When somebody really has that commitment and they want to move to the next level, and that next level is not made available to them because they can't have the exclusivity. This leads to resentment. So there are people that make this work. I think polyamory makes sense for some people, but we really need more research to understand how these structures operate and how successful they usually are, and what can be done in terms of mental health treatment to help people in those relationships to get the most out of the relationships, to find the most satisfaction, and to meet their goals. So I know whenever I talk about topics like open relationships and polyamory and love, there are a lot of different opinions and thoughts. If you agree or disagree with what I've talked about here in this video, please put those thoughts and opinions in the comments section. As always, I hope you found this discussion of polyamory to be interesting. Thanks for watching.